Hello. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our virtual Dirshu Mishnah Berurah share. We're holding today in Mishnah Berurah Chelik Hey. We will be learning Daf Kuf Yud Dalet Amid Beis. We're actually going to begin the share on the bottom line of Kuf Yud Dalet Amid Aleph, and we begin Siman Tov Kuf Aleph. Eitzim ha'asurim v'hamutarim b'Yom Tov. The different types of wood that are either permissible for use or prohibited for use on Yom Tov, Ubay Zayin Seifim, and in this Siman, we're going to have 7 Seifim. I just adjust my mic over there slightly. Okay, that's a little bit better. All right, says the Mechaber, Ein mevakin eitzim min hakayrais sha'imdais lebinyan. You're not allowed to chop pieces of wood off of beams that have been set aside for use for construction. So somebody needs wood for his, he wants to burn some wood, he wants to cook for Yom Tov, which is a malacha that's mutter l'tzarech Yom Tov, but he needs firewood. So he has some beams out in the yard that he set aside for a construction project, and he wants to know, are you allowed to chop firewood from those beams? Says the Mechaber, no. Ein mevakim eitzim min hakayros sha'imdais lebinyan. You're not allowed to chop firewood out of beams that have been set aside for construction purposes. And we're going to see that the reason for that is they're muktzah machmas chisaron kis. Those are muktzah, they're set aside from Yom Tov use because they're valuable. You need them for your construction project, and they're not considered to be available for Yom Tov use as firewood. You wouldn't do that. You don't want to lose the money that you invested in your construction lumber to use it for burning. Says the Mishnah Berurah, nice cut in Aleph, sha'imdais lebinyan. These have been set aside for construction. Umukzahem, therefore the muktzah. Sha'adam makbid aleihem machmas chashivusan, because a person is makbid not to use them because they're chashiv, they're valuable. Umiyachid lehem makaim, so much so that he sets them aside and he puts them in an assigned place in order so that they should be protected and they should be available for his construction project. But they're not something that's just available for any other use. And even according to those lenient opinions that we saw earlier in Siman Tov Tzadik Hey, that are makel on certain types of muktzah on Yom Tov. If you remember back in Tov Tzadik Hey, we said there is an opinion. Let's say you have apples that you set aside for schira. You took apples, you put them in sacks, and you're intending on selling apples. So you have 2-pound sacks of apples. Really, to a certain extent, those apples are muktzah. You set them aside for commercial purposes. They're not really available for eating on Yom Tov. However, there are those shittas that say that on Yom Tov, that's not really considered muktzah, because the bottom line is if you have a hankering for an apple, you'll take an apple. They're royal achila. They're eminently usable. Just it happens to be that you decided you're going to use them for schira. So there are those opinions that are very makel on muktzah on Yom Tov, and they say that's not considered muktzah on Yom Tov. However, over here we were talking about the beams that are set aside for construction purposes, says the Chavetz Chaim, va'afilu lahamatirin muktzah stam. Even according to those more lenient opinions that are makel by normal cases of muktzah, but muktzah machmas chisaron kis moidu. But by muktzah of this type, where something is considered set aside because somebody doesn't want to suffer a monetary loss, somebody has valuable construction beams, nobody is going to take those beams and cut them up for firewood. Firewood is cheap. Construction beams are expensive. They're muktzah, they're set aside machmas chisaron kis, because somebody is not prepared to suffer that financial loss to use his construction beams for firewood, and therefore that muktzah is a muktzah that even the more lenient opinion is machmir. They're machmir. They rule stringently on that type of muktzah, because the apples that were set aside for construction purposes, over there, the lenient opinions say somebody didn't really set them aside to that extent. If he has a hankering for an apple, he'll take an apple out of the sack and he'll eat it. But something that's muktzah machmas chisaron kis over there, that's something that he was mesiach das mehem legamri. He totally removed his mind. He never had even a dream to use his construction beams for firewood. So that's a much more stringent level of muktzah. And even those that are mekel on muktzah and Yom Tov, there would be machmir over here. Says the Mechaber weiter. So you can't chop firewood from your construction beams for Yom Tov. So too, if you had a beam that somehow snapped on Yom Tov, you had some kind of structure, and there was a beam there, and the beam broke on Yom Tov. Now it's a broken beam. Maybe you want to take wood from that. You want to cut off some firewood from that piece. No, that's also not available for Yom Tov use. And this is even true if the beam was noticeably weak already on Erev Yom Tov, and so much so that already on Erev Yom Tov, you looked at that beam and you said, you know what, that beam looks like it might snap on Yom Tov. Now, in that case, you might think maybe that beam is available for use on Yom Tov as firewood. Maybe that's not considered muktzah. Maybe my mind was already on that beam. I looked at that beam on Erev Yom Tov and I said, you know what, that beam looks to me like it might break. If it breaks, I'll have it available as firewood. Says the Mechaber, no, you can't chop wood even from such a beam. Says the Mishnah Berurah, nice cut and bays on the bottom line of Kuf Yodalet Amud Aleph. Afilu imaisa re'ua. This beam broke on Yom Tov. You're not allowed to chop firewood from it, even if it was noticeably weak on Erev Yom Tov. Says the Chavetz Chaim, why? So first of all, he says, why would you think that maybe in this case it's mutter? The yachaliyos, because you would say it's possible the mitzape me erev Yom Tov, that the owner of this structure was already looking at this beam and hoping and thinking that it would be available for use on Yom Tov. The mitzape me erev Yom Tov, he was already thinking on erev Yom Tov and hoping shetishaver, that this beam is going to break, and therefore v'lo yaktzeh, and therefore he didn't set it aside. It wasn't set aside. Muktzah is the opposite of muchan. Muktzah means it's set aside from Yom Tov use. A beam that's built into a structure is not available for Yom Tov use. No one's cutting the rafters of their house to use for firewood. But in this case, where the beam was noticeably weak, it could be that the owner already looked at it and he wasn't Mesiach Das from it. He looked at it and he said, that beam might break and it might be available for use as firewood. So you might think, V'lo yaktzeh, says the Chavetz Chaim, Mikol Mokaim, nevertheless, Aser, that beam is still prohibited for use on Yom Tov. Why? Mishum da'al kalpanim ben hashmashos lo hoisa shvura. Because the bottom line is that ben hashmashos going into Yom Tov, was the beam broken? No. So at ben hashmashos going into Yom Tov, that beam was utakua bebinyan. It was built into the structure. Nobody's removing a piece of a structure of a house or of a shed to cut firewood for it for Yom Tov. So if bein hashmashos, it was not broken and it was tekua bebinyan, it was firmly placed into the structure, then v'nesra, it is prohibited. V'shuv eina niteres. It was usher for use at bein hashmashos. At bein hashmashos, it totally was not available for use as firewood, and therefore, once it was usher at the time of bein hashmashos, it remains usher for the entire Yom Tov. Va'oid, and the Chavetz Chaim gives you another reason why this beam is not available for Yom Tov use and it's usher, to have your noilud, because this is also a case of noilud. This is something that changed its status completely, and it turned into a new status. Noilud means it was born. It turned into a new status on Yom Tov. Why? Demeikara koira, because at the outset of Yom Tov, it was a beam that was part of a house. V'havya kikli, it was a keli. V'hashta eitzim ba'alma, and now that it broke, now it became wood. Now it became firewood. So that's noilud. Its status totally changed from before Yom Tov to Yom Tov. And we said earlier in Tov Tzadikei that even those shitas that are mekel on muktzah, they are not mekel by the muktzah of noilud. Umitamzeh, and because of this additional reason of noilud, lo higia harama kan k'moi b'simin Tov Tzadikei t'yesh matira muktzah. That's why the Ramah does not comment over here and say, well, there are some lenient opinions that hold that you could be mekel on muktzah on Yom Tov. So maybe this beam that broke on Yom Tov, where there's a tzad to say, like we said earlier, that it's not so muktzah because it was weak going into Yom Tov. So maybe the person wasn't really Mesiach Das from that beam. So maybe it's like the apple that you set aside for schira. It's like the sacks of apples that you set aside for business use, where we could say that according to those that are mekel on muktzah on Yom Tov, this beam, the same way the apple, if you had a hankering for an apple, you would eat the apple, and therefore the apple is not muktzah. Maybe this beam that you looked at an Erev Yom Tov and you saw that it was weak, maybe it's not so muktzah and you could cut firewood from it on Yom Tov, but you see that the Ramah does not say that. The Ramah doesn't comment over here and say that according to the Mekilim on muktzah, you could be mekel on this beam. So Chavetz Chaim explains why is that. Mishum desamach atzmai al masham esayim sham ta'afilu ha'mekilim le'rotzu lahakal b'muktzah d'noilad. Because like the Ramah said back in Tov Tzadik Hey, even those shitas that are mekel on muktzah and Yom Tov, the same way we said at the outset of this year, that they're not mekel on the muktzah of machmas chisar and kiss, they wouldn't be mekel on the construction beams that are set aside. You have a stack of 4x4s that are in your backyard that you're building a new deck. So those are not available for Yom Tov use, even according to the Mekilim, because the muktzah machmas chisar and kiss. So too over here with the beam that broke, that's also not available for firewood, even according to the Mekilim, because it's muktzah machmas noilad. It's something that had a total status change from before Yom Tov to Yom Tov, and the Mekilim are not mekel when it comes to noilad. Okay. So far we have two cases over here that the Mechaber said you cannot use this wood for firewood on Yom Tov. If you have your 4x4s in a stack set aside for building a deck, those are muktzah machmas chisar and kiss. You can't use those. And a beam that broke on Yom Tov, even though it was weak before Yom Tov, you can't use that for firewood either because it's muktzah machmas noilad, or because at the outset of Yom Tov at Ben Hashmashos, it wasn't broken yet. So at the outset of Yom Tov, it was part of the house, and therefore it was muktzah at Ben Hashmashos. It's muktzah for the rest of Yom Tov. Now we continue on the top line in the Mechaber on Kuf Yudalad Amid Beis. Aval, however, right by the Ois Gimel for the Mishnah Berurah. Aval, im nishbara me Erev Yom Tov. If you have a beam that broke already on Erev Yom Tov, then that's already not considered a beam anymore. That already broke. It's already a broken beam. A broken beam is available for use as firewood. It's not construction material anymore. It's not something that's royal opinion. It's broken. And it's not part of the structure anymore because it's already broken. So if you have a beam that broke already on Erev Yom Tov, that's available for firewood. And therefore, it says to Mechaber, Im efshar lahasika b'loi bikua, if it's too large to use as firewood, it's a big piece, and you can't put it under your pot to cook it. Maybe it's just too big for the fireplace. It's too big for the oven, or it could be it's also too big to burn right away. So maybe you have to cut it up into smaller pieces. If you cannot use it as firewood without cutting it up, without chopping it up, you're allowed to cut large pieces from it. Now, what the Mechaber means over here is you're allowed to cut large sections from this beam to use as firewood, but you're not allowed to cut it up into very small pieces that you would use for kindling. That's what the Mechaber means when he says here, Mevakin mimena chatichais gedolos. You could chop off of it large pieces, but you cannot cut it up into very small pieces of the type that you would use for kindling. And the Mishnah Berurah is going to explain that in that case, there would be a chash of the malach of teichen, of grinding. And teichen, we said, is one of the malachas that are not even mutter on Yom Tov, not even l'tzarech eichel nefesh. So you could cut it, you could chop it into large pieces, but not into small pieces. And the Mechaber continues, V'lo yavaka, and when you chop it up, you should not chop it loy bekardoim, not with an axe, v'loy b'magol, not with a sickle, v'loy b'megera, not with a saw. These are all the typical types of implements that you would use to chop up this beam. And the Mechaber is telling you, even though we're matir you to chop up the beam, still you're not allowed to do it in the normal derech. You must do it with a shinui. So you can't use the normal tools. You can't use an axe. You can't use a sickle. You can't use a saw. Ella bekupitz. Rather, you have to use a cleaver. Says the Ramah in the parentheses here, Pirish, what's a kupitz? Sakin shel katsavim. This is the cleaver of a butcher. V'yesh oisim by shnei Russian, and very often they were made with two heads. The head of this kupitz had two sides. Daimik tzas lekardaim, and it was similar to an axe. And the Mechaber continues, ubetzada kotzer shaloi. If you're going to use this kupitz to chop up the wood, you have to use the narrow side of the kupitz. Avaloi betzad harochav. You cannot use the wide side of the kupitz, because using the wide side of the kupitz is very similar to using an axe, and that would not constitute a shinui. So you have to do this with a shinui, and in order to do this with a shinui, you use this kind of cleaver. So right away, you're not using the normal implement, and you only use the narrow side of the cleaver, not the wide side of the cleaver. However, the Mechaber continues and he says, "V'yesh misha oiser afilu bekupitz." However, there are those that aser, that prohibit chopping up the wood even with a kupitz, and this is brought down. If you look in the Berurah, this is brought down the Torah in the name of the Smak, and it comes from a Tosfos in Be'an Lamed Aleph Amid Beis. There are those that aser even using the kupitz. Why? So the words of the Mechaber are "Lefi she'ein anu bekiyin mahu." Because we're not baki, we're not proficient in knowing what constitutes a kupitz. Now, I think from looking into Tosfos and Beah, that what this means is we don't know for sure what the Gemara meant when the Gemara said that you could use the narrow side and not the wide side. What constitutes narrow and therefore it's mutter because it's considered a shinui? What constitutes wide and therefore it's not considered a shinui and it's also? We don't know precisely what they meant. And therefore, we're not prepared to be matir even the use of a kupitz. And according to this yesh misha oiser, we would only be matir using a knife, which is clearly not the type of tool that's usually used for cutting up wood, or like the Mishnah Berurah said, if you could break it with your hand. But we wouldn't be matir even a kupitz. Okay, we read a lot of Mechaber over here. Now let's take a look at the Mishnah Berurah. So the first thing that we said over here in the Mechaber was, if you have a beam that broke on Erev Yom Tov, then you're allowed to cut wood off it to use for firewood. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Eis Gimel, Aval Im, if it broke before Yom Tov, what the Mechaber wants to say over here is, if a beam broke before Yom Tov, Dina Kistam Eitzim Ha'imdim Lahasaka, then it's no longer considered part of the structure. It's no longer considered Muktzah Machmas Chesaron Kiss, because we don't consider it anymore construction materials. It's not set aside for the use of a construction project like your 4x4s that you have set aside for your deck. It's a broken beam. It's stam eitzim. It's regular old wood, and regular wood is considered aymed lahasaka. It's prepared for use for burning, and burning for bishul on Yom Tov is mutter. So it's completely available for use. And therefore, continued the Mechaber, and the Mechaber said, okay, if it's a beam that broke before Yom Tov, it's available for use. However, there's a couple of caveats. You want to go ahead and you want to cut pieces off of it because it's too large to burn the way it is. So then the Mechaber said, Mevakin mimena, ice cut and dalit in the Mishnah Berurah, you're allowed to cut pieces off of it. Oh, says the Chavetz Chaim, wait a second. Even though you might wonder, wait a second, why am I allowed to do this on Yom Tov? I have over here a beam that broke already on Erev Yom Tov. So it's aymed lahasaka. It's ready for use for firewood, but it's too big. Well, if it's too big and you have to cut it up, that's machshirei oichel nefesh. That's not directly the burning of the wood that you're doing for bishul. That's havara l'tzarech oichel nefesh. That's not machshirei oichel nefesh. That's not a preparatory step for oichel nefesh. That's mamish cooking. That's oichel nefesh. But cutting the wood to size to use for firewood, that's machshirei oichel nefesh. And this wood was available already on Erev Yom Tov. So why are you allowed to do it on Yom Tov? Why aren't you mechuyev to do it on Erev Yom Tov? Says the Mishnah Berurah, that's not a question. Kevan the efshar lefais ulavashel beloy eitzim, since it is impossible to cook without firewood. Also, I saw kedichas melach. The Chachamim looked at the malacha of chopping up wood to size, similar to the crushing of salt. Shemutter al yedei shinoi, which is a malacha that's mutter if you do it al yedei shinoi. It's something that technically you could have done on Erev Yom Tov, but it's totally necessary for the cooking process, and therefore there were more makel on it. And they said you could do it with a shinoi. Now, the explanation of this this concept over here, that since it's completely necessary for Eichel Nefesh, they were matter you to do it, even though l'chayr it's machirei Eichel Nefesh you could have done on Erev Yom Tov. The Mishnah Berurah is being very concise over here, because this is a complicated piece of lumdus. It's a very complicated here to go through the Rishonim and process exactly what the heter over here is. One of the things that the Rishonim say is, when, let's say you have a wood pile. Let's say, I see this all over Staten Island, people who burn a lot of wood. You go out in their backyards, they have a big wood pile where they have firewood. You go to the matzah bakery, they have a whole big wood pile over there that they use for burning. Even in the wood pile itself, which are logs that were already split for burning purposes, there are bigger pieces, there are smaller pieces. Sometimes you need a bigger piece, sometimes you need a smaller piece. Sometimes you get down near the end of the wood pile, and it turns out that you don't really have the type of wood that you need. You only have pieces of wood that are very big. So it is perfectly normal, and it is part of the burning and cooking process that very often you have to take a piece of wood and cut it down to size. So it's not pshat that you did not adequately prepare on Erev Yom Tov. That's not called something that's really efshar lasais me Erev Yom Tov. I'm not mechuyev to look through my wood pile and make sure that I have all the right size pieces of wood. The truth is, you might not even know until you're actually making the fire. So this is considered very much an integral, normal part of the bishul process on Yom Tov. Is sometimes you look at the wood pile and you don't have the right size piece of wood, so you got to cut it down. So they were materit if you do it with a shinui. Continues the Mishnah Berurah, and he says, "V'gam zeh lo yitiru ela b'chatichos gedolos delav malachahi." However, when they were matir, cutting up the pieces of wood with a shinui, it's only when the cutting up of the pieces of wood does not constitute a malacha gemura, when it's not really a malacha da'araisa, what you're doing. Ella uvda dechayil. Rather, the only reason it's usher over here is because it's an uvda dechayil. This is not really Yom Tov activity. This is really a weekday activity, which is more an Issa D'Rabbanan, and also it's Tirchi Yisera on Yom Tov. We don't want you to be busy doing this kind of activity on Yom Tov. That's when they're matter you to do this with a shinui. Avaloi b'chatichos ketanois. But like I spoke out when we read the Mechaber, you're not allowed to cut it into very small pieces. The yesh ba mishum chash toichen. Because if you're cutting up the wood into very small pieces, small shavings of the type that you would use for kindling, then there's a chash of the malacha daraisa of toichen. Because let's remember, we're dealing with gedulei karka over here. We're dealing with wood that grows from the ground, and you're cutting it up into small pieces. Over there, you have the possibility of the malacha daraisa of toichen, which might be also on Yom Tov even midaraisa. So that they weren't matir even with a shinoi. But to cut up big pieces, so what is that? That's uvda dechayil, it's terchi yisera. That they were matir to do al yedei shinoi, since it's considered an integral part of the cooking process. Now we go to ois cut and hay. The Mechaber said you can't do this with an axe, you can't do it with a saw, you can't do it with a sickle. Ella bekupitz, you have to use a cleaver. Kedei lasei shinoi. The reason for this is it's only mutter al yedei shinoi. Then the Mechaber said, and when you use the kardaim, you have to use the narrow side. Avaloi b'tzad harachav. You cannot use the wide side. Why? Because the wide side of the cleaver is mamish like an axe. And if you use that, you're not making a shinoi. Then the Mechaber said there's a yesh misha oisa that you can't even use the kupitz because we're not a bucky, we're not proficient, and we don't know what the Chazal considered wide, what the Chazal considered narrow, and therefore they were only matter with a sakin, ois cut and zayin, Ella b'sakin, only matter with a knife, oil l'shabra b'yad, or to break it with your hand, which is certainly a shiur. Now we turn to Sif Beis. Says the Mechaber, Eitzim gedolim ktsas, pieces of wood that are somewhat large, u're'uyim la'asaka b'loy bikua. And even though you might prefer to break it or cut it into a smaller piece, but it is royal la'asaka, it is usable the way it is without chopping it, lo yavaka klal. Those you're not allowed to chop up at all. Va'afilu l'shabram b'yad yesh misha oiser. And even to break them by hand, there are those that say it's aser. Says the Mishnah Berurah, ois cotton ches, lo yavaka klal. If it's big enough so that it can be burned the way it is, you're not allowed to chop it at all. Ritzayna Loimar, what the Mechaber wants to say over here, the Mechaber uses this turn of phrase, lo yavaka klal. You cannot chop it at all. Ritzayna Loimar, what the Mechaber means to say is, loimi baya lavaka lakatichos dachos ma'oid. Not only you're not allowed to chop it up into small pieces for shavings for kindling, the yesh bazach shash teichen, which we said before is aser on Yom Tov because it's possibly the malacha of teichen. Ela afilu la'asaysam chatichos she'enon dakos, even to chop it into large pieces that are not small, gam kein aser, is also prohibited if it's usable the way it is. Kevin sheyachal avashal kedei rasay b'loy bikua, since you could use it to burn under your pot and use it for fuel for cooking even without chopping. So then why are you chopping it? That's a tircha yisera shalayla tzarich Yom Tov. It's exertion which is not required for Yom Tov at all, and therefore it's aser. And says the Chavetz Chaim, therefore, the hamadaktikim, those who are very careful when it comes to mitzvahs and when it comes to isurim, the hamadaktikim, noyagim, they're accustomed lizayer af b'chol hamoed, even to be careful on chol hamoed. Shemisakdim kol ha'etzim aktanim, they would prepare any small pieces of wood, hatzrichim levishul dogim, which they needed for cooking fish. Apparently, we know that fish cooks up in a very small amount of time. Very short, not small. A very short amount of time. So to cook fish, apparently what they needed was a relatively small and a relatively short-lived fire. So for that, you really want smaller pieces of wood. So the medaktikim, who knew that they were going to be cooking fish on Chol Hamoed, and they knew that they needed these small pieces of wood. Now the chiddush of Chol Hamoed over here is that even for Chol Hamoed, they were careful. Not only on Yom Tov they were careful, but even on Chol Hamoed, even if they knew that for Chol Hamoed they're going to need these small pieces of wood, they were medaktik to prepare those small pieces of wood koydem Yom Tov, before Yom Tov. Shahari Yachal Avaray B'loy Bikua. Because now it's Chol Hamoed, I didn't prepare small pieces of wood, so I'm going to have to burn a big piece of wood. Well, what heter do you have to cut small pieces? If you could burn this big chunk the way it is, what heter do you have? Even on Chol Hamoed, they were medaktik not to go cut smaller pieces. They didn't even want to do that malacha on Chol Hamoed. Forget to do the malacha on Yom Tov. Zich on Yom Tov, they didn't want to chop. Like the Mechaber said, if you could burn it the way it is, they didn't want to cut it up into smaller pieces. But they were medaktik, even the small pieces that they needed for Chol Hamoed, they prepared before Yom Tov. Says in the Chavetz Chaim in the brackets here, Va'af levakeya b'chol Hamoed eitzim gedoyloi she'yefshel lavashabam kamoi shehein. These medaktikin were medaktik even if they had big pieces of wood that were not burnable the way they are. So we said it's really mutter. If you can't burn it the way it is, the Mechaber said it's mutter to cut it up into smaller pieces if you do it with a shinoi. The medaktikim, even on Chol Hamoed, came and she'efshel lahakin kaidem Yom Tov, since really they could have prepared their firewood from before Yom Tov, yesh lahakin kaidem Yom Tov, really you should do it before Yom Tov, unless you didn't have the wood available to you before. However, the Mishnah Berurah says, it's very fascinating, the wording that the Mishnah Berurah is going to use here. However, in areas where firewood is very expensive, the heavy hefsid, and it would entail financial loss. I want to cook up a small pot of fish. I need a fire that's going to burn for 20 minutes. That's all I need. Now you're telling me that I have a big piece of wood that really I could burn it the way it is. So I shouldn't cut it up into smaller pieces. But, says the Mishnah Berurah, if there's going to be a hefsid, the davar avud, and this is a davar avud on chalamayid. If I burn the big piece of wood now, I'm taking a loss. Im yavarim k'may shehein, mitzvah lachtoichaisam lachatichais takais. He says that then on chalamayid, it's a mitzvah to cut it up into small pieces. So again, what do we have over here? We have the mechaber that said, if you have large pieces of wood that could be burned the way they are, you have no heter to chop them up into small pieces, because that's a tircha shaloi l'tzarich Yom Tov. There's no heter to do that. It's very nice that you would like to have a smaller piece, but you have no right to cut it up on Yom Tov and to be matriach on Yom Tov. It's not a tzarich Yom Tov. You need wood to cook. You have wood to cook. So you're not allowed to cut it up on Yom Tov. On chalamayid, there were medaktikim who were medaktik on chalamayid to go prepare small pieces of wood for chalamayid use. They didn't even want to cut it up on chalamayid. However, it says the Mishnah Berurah, in a place where firewood is very expensive, and now you're going to waste wood because you're going to take a big chunk of wood that could burn for an hour, and you're going to burn up an hour's worth of firewood where you only need 20 minutes worth of firewood. Then says the Mishnah Berurah, mitzvah. It's a mitzvah to cut the big piece of wood up into smaller pieces and burn smaller pieces. Now, he doesn't say it's a mutter. He doesn't say it's permissible. He says it's a mitzvah. Why is it a mitzvah? So the Mefarshim give different reasons why this would be called a mitzvah. One reason is that one of the reasons there's an isser of malacha on chalamayid. Why is there an isser mitzvah? Why is there an isser malacha on chalamayid? Why are there things that you're not to do on chalamayid? Because really on chalamayid, we want people to be in the Bismedrash learning Torah. You have a day that's Yom Tov. It's a quasi Yom Tov. It's a special day. It's not a day for doing malacha. Go into the Bismedrash, sit and learn. Go to shul, have a nice long davening, then make a nice suda l'kavod Yom Tov, then go into the Bismedrash and sit and learn. Now, if you're going to have to burn up extra wood, that's going to be mitzayer you, because you're losing money, you're taking a hefsid mammon, that's going to take away from your menukas hanefesh. So that's why it's actually a mitzvah to cut it up into smaller pieces and not take a hefsid mammon. Ice cutting test, the mechaber said, va'afilu l'shabram biyad. Not only is it usher to cut up these pieces that you don't really need to cut, you're not even allowed to break them by hand. Says the Chavetz Chaim, since they're roi, they're usable the way they are, even breaking them by hand is considered a tercha shaloi l'tzarech, which you should not do. And the Mishnah Berurah said, the Mechaber said, Yesh Misha Oyser, says the Mishnah Berurah is cutting Yud, Yesh Misha Oyser, V'chein iskimu kama achrayim, and he says many achrayim agreed to this position that even to break them by hand, you should not do. Now we turn to Sif Gimel. Says the Mechaber, 2 lines from the bottom. Ein mevi'in eitzim min hasodeh. You're not allowed to go, you need firewood for your cooking on Yom Tov, so you want to go out to the field, and you want to bring in some firewood from the field. Says the Mechaber, Ein mevi'in eitzim min hasadeh. You're not allowed to go collect firewood from the field. Afilu hayu mechunasin sham miba'erev. Even if they were gathered in the field already from before Yom Tov. Now you would say it's already gathered. The firewood is already gathered together in the field on Erev Yom Tov. There doesn't seem to be any tzad of muktzah here. It's adarabah. It's muchan. I prepared it for use as firewood already from before Yom Tov. So what's the problem over here? Why am I not allowed to bring it in on Yom Tov? Says the Mishnah Berurah, Eis Katan Yud Aleph, Afilu mechunasin sham mibayerev. Even if you had this firewood prepared and gathered together in the sadeh on Erev Yom Tov, you're still not allowed to take it from the sadeh into the house to burn it on Yom Tov. Says the Chavetz Chaim, miloshen zeh, from the language of the Mechaber, mashma, it is implied that afilu hechinon mibayerev. Even if you prepared this wood for firewood before Yom Tov, so there's